It started as an ordinary Sunday brunch at my parents' place. My younger brother, Nate, and I were sitting around the table with my mom and dad, everyone catching up, talking over coffee and eggs. Nate had been quieter than usual, but I thought maybe he was just tired or hungover. That was Nate, after all, always burning the candle at both ends, partying hard, and then crashing even harder. But then, just as I was helping Mom clear the dishes, Nate's phone buzzed on the table. Normally, I wouldn't pay any attention, but he'd stepped out for a moment, and his phone was practically lighting up with notifications. I glanced over out of pure habit, not meaning to pry, and caught a glimpse of an email subject that made my stomach drop. It was from a collections agency. I pretended not to see it, but my mind started racing. Nate was terrible with money. That much I knew. He was the kind of guy who'd blow his whole paycheck on a new gadget or a night out with friends and then be borrowing cash to get through the rest of the month. Still, seeing that email, with final notice bolded in the subject line, made me worry that things had spiraled far worse than I'd realized. He came back a few minutes later, looking none the wiser. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. He's my little brother, and even though he's an adult, I felt this pull to check in to make sure he was okay. When we were heading out, I pulled him aside away from our parents. "Hey, Nate, is everything okay with you?" I started, trying to keep it casual. "I noticed you got a message from a collections agency. Do you need help with something?" His face changed instantly. I saw his jaw clench, his eyes narrow. "Were you going through my phone?" he asked, his voice sharp and defensive. "No, it kept lighting up on the table, and I saw the subject line by accident." I said, stumbling a bit. "Look, I'm not judging. I know things can get tight sometimes. I just want to help if you need it." "Well, I don't need it," he shot back, crossing his arms. "I'm handling it just fine on my own." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel myself getting frustrated. "Nate, come on. I'm not trying to invade your space. But you're my brother, and if things are bad enough that collections agencies are chasing you, I can't just ignore it." He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "This is exactly why I don't tell anyone anything. I knew you'd make a big deal out of it. I don't need you to come save me, all right?" I was stunned, standing there in the driveway, while he glared at me. "I'm not trying to save you, Nate. I'm just offering support. There's a difference." "Oh, really?" he scoffed. "Well, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're just butting into something that isn't your business." That hit me hard. Here I was thinking I was being the caring, responsible older sibling, and he was looking at me like I was meddling in his life. It stung, especially since I genuinely thought I was helping. I wanted him to feel like he could count on me, that he didn't have to deal with his problems all alone. But clearly he saw it as me overstepping, maybe even doubting his ability to handle his own life. I took a deep breath, feeling both hurt and frustrated. "All right, fine. I won't bring it up again. But I just want you to know that if you do need help, you can come to me." He rolled his eyes, barely meeting my gaze. "Yeah, well, don't hold your breath." I left feeling deflated, the usual lightness of family brunch replaced by this heavy, nagging sense of guilt. On one hand, I still felt like I'd done the right thing by checking in. I couldn't just sit back and watch him drown in debt. But maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't my place to step in uninvited, even if I was worried. The whole way home, I kept replaying our conversation, second-guessing every word. Was I really out of line? I just wanted to be there for him. But maybe he felt patronized, like I was undermining his independence. I thought family was supposed to look out for each other, but maybe my idea of help came across as interference. Now I'm stuck here, wondering if I just drove a wedge between us by trying to help him. So, AITA? A few weeks ago, my best friend, Kara, and I decided to throw a Halloween party together. We're both pretty social, and we've been wanting to host something that would become the Halloween event of the season. We came up with this grand plan of a spooky, haunted house theme with elaborate decorations, themed drinks, costumes, and games. We were practically bouncing off the walls with ideas. Now, Kara and I have very different planning styles. She's a big picture dreamer. She'll come up with all these amazing ideas, but isn't the greatest with the little details. I, on the other hand, like to say I'm more practical, which, okay, sometimes means I tend to cut a few corners. We agreed that she'd handle the decorations and scary atmosphere stuff, and I'd take care of the food, drinks, and games. I thought it was a pretty fair split, and we both promised to go all out. Fast forward to about a week before the party. Kara was texting me excitedly about the haunted house feel she was envisioning, and I told her all about these creepy Halloween snacks I'd seen online, which, let's be real, I probably wasn't going to make myself. Work was crazy for both of us, so the party planning became one of those I'll get to it later things. I figured it's Halloween. People will come in costumes, they'll be happy with some chips and booze, and honestly, I trusted that Kara would bring the whole spooky vibe on her end. The night of the party arrived, and I was a little frazzled. I'd ended up working late that day, and by the time I got home, I had barely an hour to pull my part together. I ended up tossing some candy in bowls, grabbing a few bags of chips, and frantically pulling together a punch that was really just vodka and red food coloring. As for the games I'd promised, I figured I'd wing it with some impromptu charades and maybe bobbing for apples or something. I headed over to Kara's place, hauling my last-minute Halloween snacks and an assortment of solo cups, expecting to walk into a spooky haunted house extravaganza. Instead, I was greeted by nothing. Nothing Halloween-y at all. She had put out a single orange candle and a pumpkin from her front steps. That was it. No decorations, no creepy lighting, not even a fake spiderweb. I felt my stomach sink. Kara, what happened to all the haunted house stuff? She gave me a sheepish look. Oh, I didn't really have time. I thought you'd be bringing some stuff too, right? I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. No, I was doing the food and games. You were handling the haunted house decorations. We talked about this. She shrugged, looking almost defensive. Well, I thought you might pick up some extras too, just in case. And besides, you didn't bring that much food either. I looked at my spread, a sad pile of chips, candy, and my lazy person punch, and realized it wasn't exactly impressive. But I felt a surge of irritation anyway. Maybe because I thought you'd have at least something set up here for atmosphere? She shot back. Well, if you were so set on this vibe, maybe you should have helped with the decorations. I didn't know what to say. I could feel my blood boiling and, honestly, a little embarrassed. People were starting to arrive, and I saw them glancing around, clearly expecting something way more exciting than the lukewarm setup we'd managed to slap together. We tried to play it off, laughing about how it was low-key and minimalist scary, but it was pretty clear that people were unimpressed. I could see our friend Jess whispering to her boyfriend and glancing around like she was mentally planning her escape. Some people actually left early to check out another party across town, and those who stayed kind of politely picked at the chips and half-heartedly complimented the vibe, which was just sad. By around midnight, most people were gone. Kara and I sat there in the empty room, feeling the awkward tension settle over us. Finally, she muttered, this wouldn't have been such a flop if you'd actually put in some effort. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If I'd put in some effort? Kara, I thought you were bringing the decorations. We split this up, remember? You're the one who's always saying you're all about vibe. Oh, please, she huffed, rolling her eyes. Like you didn't phone it in. You brought chips and candy, for God's sake. That's not even close to the creepy themed stuff you said you'd make. I felt the frustration bubbling up. You know what? Maybe if you tried a little harder, I wouldn't be the only one carrying the weight here. We glared at each other, both of us too stubborn to back down. In my head, I knew we'd both been lazy, but I couldn't admit that in the moment. It was easier to put it all on her for not following through. We ended up cleaning up in silence, each of us pretending we weren't furious, but I could feel it like a storm between us. Later that night, I lay in bed, running the whole thing over in my head. Part of me felt a little guilty, like, okay, maybe I could have done more, but another part felt like she should have been responsible for her end of things. I keep wondering if I'm being unfair, or if she really did drop the ball as much as I think she... A few months ago, my coworker Sarah confided in me that she was struggling with a pretty intense workload. We're on the same team, but I'd noticed that her desk was always buried in paperwork, and she was constantly staying late, looking exhausted. So, when she mentioned how overwhelmed she was, I wanted to help. She'd been there for me a lot in the past, especially when I was going through a rough patch last year, and I figured I owed her some support. At first, I offered to take on a few of her smaller tasks, but she brushed me off, saying she didn't want to burden anyone else. I could tell she didn't want to admit how much she was struggling, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent a couple of nights after hours going through our shared project folders, identifying tasks that overlap with my own, and basically just started quietly tackling some of her workload without telling her. It wasn't anything huge, mostly things I could manage on my own, like completing reports, answering emails from clients, and organizing some spreadsheets she'd been too swamped to look at. I thought that if I took care of the small stuff, she'd be able to focus on the bigger projects that needed her attention. After a couple of weeks, I could see a bit of a shift. She wasn't staying as late, and she seemed a little less stressed. I felt good about it, thinking, hey, I'm actually helping her out. But then last Thursday, the whole thing blew up in my face. We were in a team meeting with our manager, reviewing some completed projects. My manager started praising me for a report that Sarah had initially been assigned, saying it was well done and thorough. Before I could explain that I'd taken it on to help her out, Sarah turned to me, her face completely blank, and said, "Wait, you did that report?" I nodded, trying to play it casual, but I could tell she wasn't happy. After the meeting, she pulled me aside in the hallway, looking angry and hurt. "Why did you take over my work without telling me?" she demanded, crossing her arms. I was caught off guard. "I just wanted to help you out," I explained. "You'd mentioned how stressed you were, and I thought if I could take some things off your plate, you'd have more time for the other projects. I didn't mean to step on your toes." Her jaw tightened. "But that's exactly what you did. You didn't ask me, and you didn't consider how it would look in front of our manager. It makes it seem like I can't handle my own workload." I was stunned. "Sarah, I was just trying to make things easier for you. I didn't think it would be a big deal since we share projects all the time." She shook her head, clearly frustrated. "But you took credit for work that was supposed to be mine. It makes me look incompetent. You know how much I've been struggling to prove myself here, and now it looks like I need you to bail me out." I could feel my face go red. I wasn't trying to take credit. I wasn't planning to say anything in the meeting. Our manager just happened to notice it. I thought I was helping, but she wasn't having it. "You didn't ask, though. That's the point. It's like you assumed you knew what I needed better than I did. I'm not a charity case, all right? I can handle my work, even if it means staying late." Her words stung. All I'd wanted was to lighten her load, and now she was acting like I'd done something terrible. "Sarah, I thought you'd appreciate it," I said, my voice dropping. "You're always there for everyone else. I was just trying to return the favor." She sighed, crossing her arms tighter. "Look, I know you meant well, but next time, don't just assume you know what's best. If I need help, I'll ask." She walked away then, leaving me standing there feeling embarrassed and, honestly, a little resentful. Here I'd been, giving up my evenings, staying late to help her out, and she was acting like I'd overstepped some huge boundary. I felt like I couldn't win. If I hadn't done anything, I would have been a bad friend for not helping. But since I did, I'm the bad guy for supposedly making her look bad in front of our boss. It's been awkward ever since. She's polite, but distant, and I'm stuck wondering if I really screwed up by not asking her first, or if she's just overreacting because of the stress. AITA? Alright, here's how my friendship with Lily got derailed over a loan I thought would be no big deal to give, and somehow became a huge deal to get back. Lily and I go way back. We've been friends since college, roommates at one point, and honestly, she feels like family. So, when she asked if she could borrow $800 to cover an emergency vet bill, I didn't hesitate. Her dog, Daisy, had been sick, and the treatment costs were just way more than she'd expected. She was frantic, worried, and in tears over possibly losing Daisy. So, of course, I transferred her the money that day. I told her to pay me back whenever she could and didn't think twice about it. At first, things seemed fine. Lily was grateful, and I was just happy Daisy was all right. She thanked me profusely, saying she'd pay it back as soon as possible, and that she'd budget to get it to me within a month or two. But, of course, a couple of months went by, and no mention of the money. Now, $800 is a lot for me. It's rent, groceries, utilities, and a few nights out rolled into one. But I reminded myself that emergencies take time to recover from, so I tried to stay calm. Still, each time we met up, I'd wonder if she'd bring it up. Then one night we were out with friends, and I overheard her talking about this expensive wellness retreat she was planning to attend the next month. She was describing how it was absolutely worth it, and how she was treating herself to some peace after a stressful year. I was shocked. Here I was quietly skipping my own weekend plans and pinching pennies to stay afloat, and she was treating herself? I couldn't believe she'd even consider splurging like that without paying me back. But instead of saying anything, I decided to wait and give her a chance to handle it on her own. Another few weeks went by, and finally, I texted her a polite reminder. Hey, any chance you'll be able to start paying me back soon? Things are a bit tight, and I'd appreciate it if we could figure something out. She texted back, apologizing profusely and saying things were still tight, but she'd get it to me as soon as she could. I tried to be understanding, but honestly, I was frustrated. I wanted to ask her if that retreat was still happening, but I didn't want to come off as petty. Fast forward to a couple of weeks later. Lily invited me to her place, and I walked in to find her place decked out with new decor, a fancy new TV, and even this high-end espresso machine on the counter. She was so excited, showing me around her redecorated space and talking about her self-care journey. I tried to smile and be happy for her, but inside, I was boiling. How was she prioritizing this self-care journey, over paying back the money I'd given to save Daisy? Before I left, I finally worked up the nerve and asked her, Hey, so, any chance you'll be able to start paying back that loan soon? I could really use it. Her face fell, and she sighed dramatically, like I'd just ruined her day. She muttered something about how money stresses her out and how she was trying to maintain her peace, and that she was really hoping I'd understand. That was the last straw. I asked her as calmly as I could how she could afford all this new stuff and a retreat if she couldn't pay me back even a little. She got defensive, saying I didn't get it and that her mental health had been suffering and she needed to take care of herself after the scare with Daisy. I told her I understood that, but that her self-care was putting a financial strain on me and that I really needed the money back. She didn't like that one bit. She shot back, saying that I was the one being unfair and putting money above friendship, and that if I really cared, I would trust her to pay me back when she was ready. I told her that trust only goes so far when it's been months and I've barely seen any effort. She snapped that if she'd known I'd obsess over the money, she wouldn't have asked me at all. Now, things are tense between us. She's avoiding me, and when I try to reach out, she either doesn't reply or sends these passive-aggressive texts about how friends should support each other unconditionally. Our mutual friends are split. Some say I should back off and give her time, while others think she's taking advantage. I'm starting to wonder if maybe I did push too hard, or if I should have waited longer before bringing it up. But at the same time, it feels like she's using her self-care as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility, and I'm the one stuck feeling like the bad guy. I'll admit it, I've always been a bit of a lone wolf, and I like my space. I don't go all in on family gatherings. I'm not the text everyday type, and I think people should respect each other's need for breathing room. But my mom, she has this habit of turning every single thing into a huge family affair. We're talking birthdays, anniversaries, random Tuesday night dinners, everything. And if you're not there, you're hurting the family. The most recent saga? My parents' 30th wedding anniversary. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my parents. I'm glad they've had a solid marriage and made it work for so long. But they decided to throw this massive anniversary party. A whole catered event with speeches, games, the works. And they picked a Friday night at the country club, which I knew would be a huge deal to everyone. But I had my own plans. I've been wanting to go to this outdoor concert that same night, something I'd been saving up for and looking forward to for months. When my mom called to remind me about the anniversary party, I mentioned the concert, just kind of testing the waters to see if she'd be okay with me missing this one event. I figured it's their night. They'll be busy with friends and family, and my presence wouldn't make or break anything. But she was not having it. She went on about how family was more important, how I owed it to them to be there, and how she couldn't believe I was even considering missing it. So, I caved. At least I said I'd come, but I still wanted to make it to that concert. So I figured I'd just make an appearance, say my hellos, and slip out after an hour or so. I thought it was a solid compromise. I'd be there for the family photos, have a drink, wish them a happy anniversary, and still make it in time to catch most of the concert. The night of the party, I showed up, did the rounds, and hung out for about an hour. I stayed through the important part, helped with a few last-minute setup things. Even gave a little speech when my mom practically shoved me up to the mic. But by the time the dinner started, I was itching to go. So, I gave my mom and dad a hug, told them I loved them, and said I had to take care of something I'd forgotten about at home. I didn't get too specific. My dad barely blinked, but my mom gave me that disappointed look. I brushed it off and left. The concert was incredible. I felt alive, free, and happy, dancing with friends and just enjoying myself. It was a magical night, and I had zero regrets in the moment. But the next morning, I woke up to a flood of messages from family members. Apparently, my mom had noticed my absence after the first hour and was not thrilled. She kept asking people if they knew where I was, if I was okay, if something had happened. She called me twice, which I ignored, figuring I'd deal with it the next day. But the real kicker? Apparently, she'd started tearing up during the party, telling everyone I'd left them on their special night. A few relatives had apparently started talking about it at the party, questioning why I couldn't just be there. So, now I was the ungrateful kid who couldn't even be bothered to stay for my parents' anniversary. I tried to tell them I had been there. I'd made an effort, and I'd made it a point to show up even when I'd had other plans. But no one cared about that. All they saw was that I wasn't there for the whole thing, and now I was the bad guy. The next time I saw my mom, she was still hurt. She said it wasn't just about showing up, it was about being there for the entire evening. She kept asking why my other plans were so important, why I couldn't have just put family first. She made me feel like I'd committed some huge betrayal. And even though I tried to explain my side, it just didn't get through. So now, things are weird. My mom barely calls me. My aunts have been making passive-aggressive comments in our family chat, and even my dad's been a bit distant. They keep making these little digs about how some people don't know how to prioritize family, and how they hope to see more of me at the next event. I know they're hurt, but I still feel like it's ridiculous to expect me to put every family event above everything else I want to do in my life. I've never had a bond like the one I share with Max. I rescued him from a shelter 9 years ago. This scrappy little mutt with wiry hair and a stubborn look in his eye. They said he'd been abandoned, that he might never really trust people. But I don't know if I'd call it rescuing him. He's the one who's been with me through some of my worst days, breakups, job losses, family drama, always looking at me like, hey, whatever, I've got you. So when I took him in for what I thought was a routine checkup and the vet found a mass on his liver, my heart sank. After some tests, she told us it was cancer. Surgery was possible, maybe even worth trying, but there were risks. If we do the surgery, the vet explained, there's a chance we can buy him some time, maybe a year, maybe more. But it's not a guarantee. It'll be a rough recovery. And at his age, there's a risk he might not bounce back. I didn't hesitate. I'd do whatever it took to give him more time. But my partner, Sarah, wasn't so sure. She loves Max. She's practically his second parent, even though we'd only been living together for about 2 years. You're really considering this? She asked gently after we got home. Of course, I said, almost offended that she even questioned it. He's my buddy. I can't just let him go. Sarah bit her lip, watching Max as he snoozed on the couch, curled up in his favorite spot. I know he's been there for you, through everything. I get it, believe me. But surgery, chemo, recovery, all that's a lot for a dog his age. She sighed, looking pained. I worry that he's going to suffer more if we try to put him through this. I could feel myself bristle, but I try to stay calm. So what? You think we just do nothing? She looked at me, sadness in her eyes. I don't want him to suffer either way. I just don't know if putting him through all this is what's best for him. Maybe it's better to let him be comfortable for as long as we can. I shook my head. If there's a chance he can make it, shouldn't we take it? He's tough, Sarah. He deserves a shot. For days, it felt like we were locked in a quiet standoff. Sarah was gentle about it, but she kept bringing up articles and studies, showing me how treatment could be grueling for dogs, especially older ones. But I couldn't let go of the stories where dogs like Max had gone through it and come out the other side, still living happy lives. See, I'd say, holding up my phone to her. These dogs got to stay with their families for years after their treatments. She'd nod, a tight smile on her face, but I knew she didn't agree. She wasn't pushing back, but I could see it in her eyes. She was scared I was clinging to the hope of a miracle, putting him through something that might be worse than the disease itself. One night, after we'd been circling this issue for what felt like forever, she took my hand. Can we go talk to the vet again? Together? She asked softly. I just want to make sure we're doing this for him. Not because we're afraid of what it'll mean for us if he goes. That last part stung, But she was right. I'd been avoiding that exact thought. That maybe I wasn't making the decision for Max, but for me. So we went together to talk to the vet, who listened carefully, then went over the realities of the surgery and recovery, as gently as she could. There's a chance he'll pull through, she said, but it'll be hard on him, especially the first few months. And with liver cancer, even surgery might only slow it down. It's always a very personal choice, and I've seen it go both ways. Some dogs do remarkably well, but some don't adjust to the recovery process. On the drive home, neither of us said anything. I felt trapped, torn between love and guilt, wondering if the best choice was to let him go, or if that was just giving up too soon. When we got home, Sarah put her hand on my arm, stopping me as I walked toward the door. Maybe we should spend some time with him, just watching him. Let's see if he's really still himself, if he still wants to fight. For the next few days, we did just that. I'd watch him closely, looking for signs of his old spark, trying to convince myself he was still the same old Max. But it was hard to ignore that he was moving slower, that he spent more time sleeping than he ever used to. He'd still follow me from room to room, still wag his tail whenever I sat beside him. But when he'd try to jump up onto the bed and stumble, I felt a pang of guilt. One night, as we lay in bed, Sarah whispered, "He's still here, but he's not, he's not really himself anymore." I knew she was right, but I couldn't say it out loud. My mind kept flashing back to when he was younger, his boundless energy, the way he'd run after tennis balls like it was his only purpose in life. I wasn't ready to let go of that. The next morning, I sat down on the floor beside him, scratching his ears, my heart pounding. He looked up at me, his eyes tired but full of trust, like he was saying, "I'm here with you, whatever you decide." And in that moment, I felt something crack. I realized that maybe I was holding on for me, not for him. Maybe I needed to give him peace instead of asking him to fight a battle he didn't understand. I looked up at Sarah, who was watching us from the doorway, her eyes filled with sadness, but also understanding. She knelt down beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders as we sat there with him, quietly accepting what we both knew had to happen. We spent that day showering Max with love, taking him to his favorite spot by the lake, giving him his favorite treats. For a few hours, he seemed like his old self, and part of me started second-guessing all over again. But then he'd limp or stop to rest, and I'd remember why we'd made this decision. When we finally took him to the vet that evening, I stayed beside him the whole time, whispering to him, telling him how much he meant to me, how grateful I was for every moment. Sarah held my hand as we said goodbye, and I could feel her crying, but she was strong, supporting me as much as she was mourning him. I tried to focus on Max's peaceful expression, his body finally relaxing, finally free from the pain. Now, every day, I feel the ache of his absence. I keep expecting him to be there, lying by my feet as I work or nudging me for his evening walk. I know, deep down, that we made the best choice for him, that he's not suffering, but there's still that small voice in my head that wonders if I gave up too soon. Did I make the right choice, letting go instead of fighting? Was I selfish, thinking it was kinder to let him go? So I'm asking, not just for my peace of mind, but because I need to know, AITA for not fighting harder to keep him with me? I thought I was done processing it, but honestly, this whole situation just keeps weighing on me. I can't seem to let it go, even though I keep telling myself to move on. Every time I try to brush it off, it sneaks back into my thoughts, leaving me with this uncomfortable, unsettled feeling that I can't ignore. And the more I reflect, the more I realize that maybe this isn't just about Danny's dinner. It's about something much bigger. I guess it's starting to dawn on me that for years now, I've been in this mindset where my own time, my own convenience, and my own priorities always came first. My whole life, I've operated on this idea that people will just get it, that they won't hold it against me if I don't show up. But now I'm wondering if that's just a story I've been telling myself, an excuse to avoid being vulnerable or uncomfortable. In some ways, I think I saw myself as the cool one in the family, the one who didn't need the big gestures, who didn't get caught up in every event. I thought it made me low maintenance, someone who kept it simple. But maybe that simplicity was just an excuse for keeping things at arm's length. And maybe Danny needed to feel that I would stand by him, even if it was just a dinner. Because that dinner wasn't trivial to him. It was a culmination of years of work and self-doubt, and he wanted the people he cared about most to witness it. Part of me keeps rationalizing that I'm not the villain here, that missing one dinner doesn't make me a bad cousin, a bad friend. But the truth is, it was more than just one dinner to him. He wanted the people closest to him to acknowledge that his hard work had led him somewhere, that he'd reached a milestone that mattered. And I failed to see that. Now I'm left wondering how many other things I've missed because I brushed them off as no big deal. How many moments, big and small, did I skip because I convinced myself they didn't matter or that people would always forgive my absence? I'm starting to see that all those little no big deal moments add up. One missed dinner might not break a bond, but a pattern of showing up late, leaving early, or skipping out entirely that can chip away at even the strongest relationships. I guess what scares me most is the thought that maybe this whole situation has exposed something about me that I didn't want to admit. Maybe I've been selfish, assuming that people would always give me a free pass. Or maybe I've just been lazy, unwilling to put in the effort when it didn't suit me. Either way, the person I see in the mirror now feels a little less noble, a little less cool than I'd always liked to believe. I thought about calling Danny's mom, trying to get her perspective, but then I stopped myself. I realized that the only person who can make this right is me. And maybe that's part of what makes this so hard, knowing that there's no quick fix, no easy undo button for the choices I made. I can apologize 1,000 times, but I can't force Danny to feel the way he used to feel about me. For now, I'm left with this weird kind of grief, a mix of regret and humility that's new to me. I thought I was immune to this kind of thing, that I'd always managed to keep my relationships intact no matter what. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe this is the price of all those years I spent skating by, assuming everyone would understand. Maybe this is the wake-up call I never saw coming. And as much as I'd love to make it right, I'm starting to realize that it might not be about fixing it right now. Maybe it's about acknowledging the lesson, about understanding that people need you to be there when it matters to them, not just when it's convenient for you. So yeah, this whole thing has been a slap in the face, and I'm still figuring out what it all means. But one thing's for sure, I'm not going to make this mistake again. But still, even now, a part of me wonders if I'm making too much of it, if I'm just letting guilt cloud my judgment. Am I really at fault here? Or is this just one of those things that got out of hand? So my friends and I had been planning a camping trip for months. We've done this every year since college, and it's usually a very simple setup. Tents, a campfire, no phones, just chilling out in the woods. It's a great way to unwind, get away from work, and catch up without any distractions. Now here's the thing, I'm not exactly the rough-it-in-the-woods type. I'm more of a hot showers and comfortable beds kind of person. But every year I've gone along with the usual plan, gritting my teeth through the sleeping bags and lack of cell service. I decided this year would be different though. I thought, why not take it up a notch and make it something a little more comfortable? I started researching glamping spots and found this amazing place that had it all. Luxury tents with beds, private bathrooms, Wi-Fi, and even a chef that would prepare gourmet meals if we wanted. It was still technically camping, but with all the comforts that, in my opinion, make the experience way more enjoyable. It was a bit pricier than our usual campsite, but I figured, hey, we're all adults now with decent jobs. Why not treat ourselves? I went ahead and booked it, thinking it'd be a fantastic surprise for everyone. I knew a few of them might be a little thrown by the change, but once they saw the setup, I was confident they'd come around. Who would say no to a bed after years of sleeping on the hard ground, right? The night before we left, I messaged everyone the address for the new location. I added a little note like, "This year, we're doing it in style. Trust me, you're going to love it." Almost immediately, my friend Mike called me, sounding a little confused. What happened to our usual spot? You know, the actual campground? I laughed and told him, "Come on, Mike, it's still camping, just upgraded. You'll see when we get there." When we all arrived, I could tell from their faces that they weren't exactly thrilled. My friend Sarah looked around at the setup, the wood floors, cozy furniture, and massive tents, and just stared at me wide-eyed. "This is not camping, dude." I shrugged and said, "It's still outdoors. Look, we got tents, we're in nature, there's a fire pit. We just get to be a little more comfortable this year." Mike shook his head, sighing. "We had an agreement, remember? Roughing it. That's like the whole point of this trip. to get away from all the luxuries. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. Come on, guys. Who says camping has to be miserable? This way, we get the best of both worlds. We can still do all the camping stuff, but we won't be sore and exhausted by the end of the weekend. Plus, there's hot coffee every morning and real bathrooms. But they weren't convinced. Sarah muttered, I didn't bring anything fancy for this, and I don't want to feel like we're at some weird outdoors spa weekend. I just wanted to get dirty, hike, and sleep under the stars. My other friend, Jenna, nodded and said she felt weirdly out of place here, too. Apparently, they'd all been looking forward to the simplicity of the woods, not glamping. Still, I thought they'd come around once they realized how much easier everything would be. That night, I ordered us a gourmet meal from the chef on site. Figured it'd win them over. I thought they'd be happy, especially after years of eating soggy hot dogs and half-burnt marshmallows. But instead, they all looked even more annoyed. Jenna sighed and said, This isn't what we signed up for. We love the usual camping food. We don't need some chef-prepared meal with truffle oil. We just wanted to cook together, you know? I laughed, thinking they were exaggerating. I mean, come on, it's just food. Tomorrow we can make s'mores by the fire pit or whatever, but I thought you'd be excited to try something a little different for once. We've been doing the same camping thing for years. The next day, though, things only got worse. I had planned a short hike for us, figuring we'd go out for a few hours and then come back to relax. But they all wanted to do a full-day hike and set up a temporary campsite in the woods, just like we'd done every other year. I tried to argue that the glamping site was nicer and that there was no need to go wandering off to build makeshift shelters in the wilderness. They were all getting really frustrated by then, especially Mike. Look, the whole point of this trip was to unplug and just live simply for a weekend. You've turned it into this luxury getaway. You didn't even ask us. That was when I felt my patience start to slip. I mean, they were making me feel like the bad guy for wanting us all to have a nicer experience. I said, You're all acting like I dragged you to a 5-star resort. We're still in the woods. It's just better woods. But they weren't having it. Sarah packed up her bag and said she was going to drive back to our usual campsite. I was like, Are you serious? It's an hour away, and we've got everything we need right here. But she insisted, saying this wasn't the trip she'd been looking forward to, and Jenna agreed. Pretty soon, all of them were packing up to go, leaving me there like the bad guy for booking a place where we didn't have to suffer just to appreciate nature. In the end, I was the only one who stayed, and everyone else went to the regular campsite to rough it the old way. I spent the weekend in the luxury tent, feeling kind of mad, but also confused about what I'd done wrong. I had genuinely thought they'd be thrilled with the change, or at least willing to give it a shot. I mean, we're adults, not college kids anymore. What's wrong with a little comfort? But now, everyone's acting distant, and Mike even said that I hijacked the trip for my own preferences. I really thought I was doing everyone a favor by making things better, but now I'm second-guessing myself. So, AITA? My dad's always been a bit of a dreamer. He's worked hard his whole life, but he's never been great with money or practical plans. Growing up, he always had some new idea for a business or an investment that would finally change things for us. Most of the time, these ideas fizzled out or left us worse off financially, but he'd brush it off and move on to the next one. I think he's just always wanted something more for our family, but it's hard to watch someone you love pour themselves into things that never quite work out. A few months ago, my dad called me with his latest idea. He wanted to open a food truck, serving burgers and barbecue. He'd never worked in the food industry before, but he was convinced he had a winning concept. I could hear the excitement in his voice as he described it. He had sketches of the truck design, a list of menu items, and even ideas for branding. At first, I went along with it. I didn't want to crush his enthusiasm. But when he mentioned that he planned to use his retirement savings to fund the whole thing, alarm bells started going off in my head. This wasn't like his other projects, where he'd maybe lost a few $100s or spent a few weekends on a failed venture. This was his entire future, the nest egg he'd spent decades building up. I asked him if he'd done any research on the costs, or if he'd put together a budget. "Oh, I've got it all figured out," he said confidently. But when I pressed him for details, his answers were vague. He talked about getting the best ingredients and hiring a top-notch team, but he hadn't even considered things like permit costs, insurance, or basic supplies. It was like he'd imagined the perfect food truck, but without any of the logistics worked out. I felt this deep, aching worry. I wanted to be supportive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a huge mistake. I know he's always wanted to do something big, to leave a legacy, but this felt like a gamble he couldn't afford to take. So, a few days later, I went over to his place. I tried to approach it gently, not wanting him to feel like I was doubting him. "Dad, I love the idea of the food truck. I started, but have you thought about starting smaller? Maybe test out some recipes at local events first, just to see if there's a market?" He frowned, his face darkening. "I've thought it through, believe me. This is what I want to do. You can't always be playing it safe." "I get that, I do," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But I just worry that putting all your retirement into this is a lot of risk. If it doesn't work out, what will you do?" He crossed his arms, leaning back with a defensive expression. "I knew you wouldn't understand," he said, his voice bitter. "I've always been willing to take risks, and that's something you and your mom could never get. That's why I'm still working this job, why I never got to do anything big in my life. I don't want to live like that anymore." I felt my throat tighten. "It's not that I don't understand, Dad. I just don't want to see you lose everything you've worked for. Maybe if you started small, you could build up and see how it goes. That way, if something goes wrong, you still have a safety net." He shook his head, his expression hardened. "You think I'm going to fail? Don't you? You think I can't make something of myself?" "No, Dad, that's not it at all," I said, feeling desperate. "I know you're capable, and I believe in you. I want you to be safe too. I don't want you to risk everything when there might be another way." He scoffed, waving me off. "That's easy for you to say. You've never had big dreams, never had to struggle to make something happen. You wouldn't get it." Those words cut deep. I tried to make a life for myself, to build something stable after watching him struggle for years. I wanted him to be proud of me, but I'd always felt this strange divide between us. Like my practicality somehow disappointed him, even though I'd only ever been trying to do what I thought was best. Now, here I was trying to protect him from himself, and he was looking at me like I was the enemy. He didn't speak to me much after that. For weeks, he barely answered my calls, and when he did, the conversations were short and tense. I felt awful, like maybe I'd been too harsh, like maybe I should have just let him follow his dream without stepping in. But every time I thought about it, I pictured him draining his retirement, left with nothing if the food truck didn't work out. Then last week, my mom called me. She told me Dad had finally met with a financial advisor, something he'd never been willing to do before. The advisor apparently told him exactly what I had, that putting his entire retirement into a food truck was a massive risk, and that he should think about finding investors or even starting smaller. When he heard it from someone else, he started to see the wisdom in it, and he was now considering launching a scaled-down version of his plan, maybe renting a small booth at a farmer's market. Part of me felt relieved, like maybe I hadn't been completely wrong to worry. But another part of me felt guilty, like I'd somehow crushed his spirit. When I called him to congratulate him on moving forward, he was cordial but distant. I could tell he was still hurt by our earlier conversation, and I didn't know if things would ever go back to the way they were. Now, I'm left wondering if I did the right thing by stepping in, or if I should have just let him try and find his own way. I wanted to save him from making a mistake, but maybe all I did was make him feel like he wasn't capable. I don't know if I'll ever get that closeness with him back, and I can't help but wonder. AITA? So, about 6 weeks ago, I got a message from my aunt asking if I could help out my cousin Jake. We were close as kids, but he'd moved out of state years ago, and we'd barely kept in touch. From what I heard, he'd been struggling with some things, lost his job, went through a rough breakup, and had nowhere to go. He needed a fresh start, and my aunt figured a change of scenery could help him get back on track. I was a little hesitant. I live alone, and I'm pretty set in my routines, but family is family, right? So, I told Jake he could stay with me for a couple of weeks, just until he found a job and a place of his own. When Jake arrived, I wanted to make him feel comfortable, so I set up the guest room with fresh sheets, toiletries, and even a little welcome basket with snacks. He showed up looking exhausted, with just a duffel bag in hand, and I could see he was going through it. He hugged me, thanked me for helping him out, and assured me he'd be out of my hair in no time. He said he was ready to turn things around, and I really wanted to believe him. The first week was fine. Jake was mostly quiet, stayed in his room a lot, but he'd come out to join me for dinner and tell me about the applications he was sending out. I made it a point to encourage him, even printed off some job listings for him and offered to help with his resume. He seemed grateful, even enthusiastic. I thought maybe he just needed a little push and some stability. But by the second week, I noticed things changing. He started sleeping in later and later, and when he was up, he'd just lounge around in his pajamas, glued to his phone or watching movies on my TV. One day I came home from work to find him in the same spot I'd left him in the morning, with a pile of snack wrappers around him. When I asked him how the job search was going, he waved it off with, "It's all online, no need to leave the house." But from what I could see, he was spending more time scrolling social media than applying for jobs. Then there was the mess. The dishes, the crumbs on the couch, the random piles of his stuff that seemed to migrate all over the apartment. I'd wake up to find the kitchen counter sticky, empty cups left in the sink, and my living room scattered with his shoes, hoodies, and even his dirty socks. When I gently reminded him to pick up after himself, he'd laugh it off with, Yeah, don't worry, I'll get it." But he never did. It felt like every day I'd come home to a new mess that somehow became my responsibility to clean. By the third week, I was starting to feel frustrated, but I told myself he was just adjusting. He'd had a rough time after all, but the strain got worse. He'd eat entire meals I'd cooked and saved for myself without even asking, saying, "Oh, I thought that was for both of us." He was using my car just for a quick errand, but would come back hours later with an empty gas tank. It got to the point where I was hiding snacks in my room and double-checking my keys just to have some boundaries. Then one day, I walked in on him hosting a group of friends in my apartment. People I'd never met, lounging around like they owned the place. And he was in the middle of pouring drinks from a bottle he'd taken from my cabinet. When I asked him why he hadn't mentioned he'd be having guests, he just laughed and said, "Oh, chill, they're only here for a bit." I was too stunned to even respond. After they left, I told him that if he wanted to have friends over, he needed to let me know first. He rolled his eyes and muttered, "Didn't think you'd be so uptight about it." Around the 5th week, I finally sat him down and asked him, gently, if he'd made any progress on his job search. He gave me this look like I'd asked him for his left kidney and said, "It's not as easy as you think. Not everyone lands a job right away." I told him I understood, but he'd been here a lot longer than we'd planned, and I really needed him to start contributing, at least to cover food or gas. He scoffed, saying, "Wow, I didn't know I was so much of a burden to you." He told me I was lucky to be stable and couldn't understand what it was like to be in his shoes. I was shocked. Here I was doing everything to help him, and he was acting like I'd insulted him by suggesting he pitch in. I explained that I'd just assumed he'd be more proactive by now, especially since this was supposed to be temporary. His response? "I didn't realize my presence was such a problem. Maybe you're just not cut out to help people." Since then, things have been icy. He's barely speaking to me, and when he does, it's just to make passive-aggressive comments about how some people just aren't as lucky or how not everyone's got it easy. Meanwhile, he's still living off my groceries, using my car, and leaving a mess everywhere. I'm walking on eggshells in my own home, wondering if I was wrong to push him or if I've just been way too lenient this whole time. Now I'm at a crossroads, feeling guilty for even thinking about asking him to leave, but also feeling completely taken advantage of. So, AITA? You know that one friend who always says, "Nothing scares me"? That's my buddy Jake. He's the most stoic, unflappable guy in our group, and he loves letting everyone know it. So, last Halloween, I decided to test his nerves a little. Nothing serious, just a harmless prank to see if he was really as tough as he claimed. Jake had this big, dramatic story he always told us about his basement. He swore it was haunted, said he'd sometimes hear weird noises coming from down there late at night. He told us the tale so many times we all knew it by heart. So, when he invited me and a few others over for a movie night, I saw my chance. I set my phone alarm to go off with eerie, creaking door sounds at random intervals. I slipped it under the couch cushions where he wouldn't find it, and we settled in for a marathon of horror movies. The first time he heard the sound, he froze, looking over his shoulder. I could see him getting tense, but he tried to laugh it off. "Old house noises, you know," he said, giving us a forced grin. But as the noises kept happening, every 15 minutes or so, he started to look genuinely freaked out. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. The look on his face was priceless. "Dude, not cool," he said, frowning. "You know I don't mess with that stuff." He laughed it off eventually, though I could tell he was a bit embarrassed. But I thought it was over. I mean, it was just a spooky noise prank, right? Little did I know, Jake had other ideas. The next morning, I went to leave for work, and my car wouldn't start. After poking around, I found out someone had unplugged my battery. I had to scramble to get it reconnected and barely made it to work on time. Later, I found out it was Jake who did it. He called me up and said, "Consider us even, man," then hung up. But it didn't feel even to me. I mean, I just messed with his head a little. He'd messed with my actual car. So I waited a few days, and then, when I knew he had to work late, I went over to his house and left a life-sized, dummy ghost figure on his front porch. I even hung it with fishing line, so it looked like it was floating. I figured it'd give him a good scare when he got home after dark. That night, I waited for a call, expecting a freaked-out reaction, but he didn't call. The next day, I saw him, and he seemed totally fine. No mention of the ghost, no reaction, nothing. I even tried to bring it up casually, but he just laughed and said, "Didn't even notice it, man. I told you, nothing scares me." I was a little miffed, but I thought it was done, until I got to work that afternoon. I walked into the office to find my desk covered in glitter, like industrial amounts. My chair, keyboard, even my mouse were glitter bombed. Every single drawer was filled with more glitter, and it was falling like confetti every time I opened something. I tried to clean it up, but glitter, as we all know, is basically impossible to get rid of. Every item of clothing I owned had a sparkle for the next month. Jake just shrugged when I confronted him and said, "Shouldn't mess with the ghost hunter, huh? Fine. If he wanted to play dirty, I'd go along." I waited until the next weekend, then rigged his bathroom mirror with some glow-in-the-dark paint, spelling out "Get Out" in dripping letters. I figured it'd only show up when he turned the lights off, so it'd give him a jump scare at night. Apparently, he didn't see it until after midnight, and from what his girlfriend told me, it scared the life out of him. They both freaked out, and she refused to use the bathroom for days. When I called him to ask how he liked the decor, he was furious. "My girlfriend's losing her mind over this. You're a real jerk, you know that?" But the idea of Jake, the guy who's scared of nothing, actually getting rattled gave me way too much satisfaction. I told him it was just some paint and that he'd survive. For a few days, I thought that was the end of it. But then I got home from work one night and found the entire contents of my front lawn, my patio furniture, my potted plants, my garden gnome collection, all wrapped in plastic wrap. Jake had covered every single piece in layer upon layer of wrap, turning my yard into a bizarre art installation. I tried to laugh it off, but it took me an hour just to free my doormat. And now I was really pissed. I wasn't about to let him one-up me like that, so I went all out. I knew he had an important family dinner coming up, some big gathering he'd been talking about for weeks. So I printed out about 50 missing person flyers with a picture of him from an old high school photo, one of those cringy, bad haircut ones, and plastered them all over his neighborhood. It wasn't my finest moment, but I thought he'd find it funny eventually. The dinner was that weekend, and from what I heard, his whole family saw the posters on their way in and started grilling him about it. His aunt even called the police, thinking it was some real missing person case. Jake was mortified. He called me up afterward, raging, telling me that I'd taken it way too far. But I didn't apologize. After all, he'd started with the glitter bomb, right? The next day, though, he went nuclear. I woke up to my phone buzzing like crazy. Notifications from every social media app, messages, tags, comments. My entire social media had been hijacked. Jake had somehow hacked into my accounts, changed my profile picture to an old, embarrassing photo from college, and made a dozen ridiculous posts that made me look like a complete fool. All day, I was getting notifications from people asking if I'd been hacked, or worse, if I'd lost my mind. I couldn't even get into my accounts to fix it. By the time I got control back, the damage was done. My family, my boss, my friends, everyone had seen it, and Jake was laughing his head off. We haven't talked much since then. The pranks were funny at first, but that last move hit a nerve. I still see the glitter around my house, and sometimes I'll catch someone from work snickering at the posts Jake made, no matter how many times I've tried to explain that they were fake. I thought we were just messing around, but I guess I pushed him too far. Or maybe he took things too far. I don't even know anymore. Alright, so here's where I'm at. My boyfriend Nate and I are about a month out from making the biggest move of our lives. We're leaving our quiet little city for New York. He's starting a job with a tech startup, and I'm transferring to a new role in my company. It's exciting, but also terrifying, and we've been talking about this for months. You'd think we'd be on the same page by now, right? Wrong. See, I'm the kind of person who thinks that every major life change should come with a comprehensive to-do list, probably multiple to-do lists, color-coded by importance and broken down by week. You get the picture. Nate, on the other hand, doesn't see why we should worry about details when we could just figure it out as we go along. New York's not going anywhere, he keeps saying, like we're just planning a weekend getaway instead of a full relocation to one of the most intense cities on the planet. Our first big argument about it happened when I brought out my moving spreadsheet after dinner. I had broken down all the major tasks: researching neighborhoods, setting a budget for movers, finding temporary storage, booking a sublet, until we settled on a long-term place. Nate glanced at it, nodding, but then he just shrugged. Looks good, he said. But do we really need all this set up right now? I mean, we have time to work out the details once we're actually there. I nearly choked on my water. Work out the details once we're there? Nate, we're moving across the country, not heading out for a picnic. He just grinned in that laid-back way that both makes me love him and want to shake him at the same time. We don't need every minute planned in advance, babe. We're just going to figure it out. Isn't that part of the adventure? I tried to see his point, I really did. I mean, I admire his calm, easygoing approach to life. He's the kind of person who never seems stressed because he trusts that things will fall into place. But for me, moving to a city like New York without a solid plan feels like stepping into an abyss. What if we get there and find ourselves overwhelmed, unprepared, and regretting every let's just wing it decision? To try to compromise, I suggested we split up the tasks. I'd handle the logistics of the move itself, like booking movers and handling all the technical stuff, and he'd focus on finding us a place to live. That way, I'd feel like we were staying on track, and he'd get to approach things in his more relaxed style. But he didn't look thrilled by the idea. I don't want to be pinned down to just finding a place, he said. Why don't we just both keep an eye out for apartments and decide when we get there? Nate, we can't just look when we get there, I argued, doing my best to keep my voice level. What if we get stuck somewhere with a sketchy landlord or end up with some absurdly overpriced shoebox? And good luck with last-minute leases in New York. He just shrugged again. We'll make it work. People find places to live in New York all the time. By now, it's become this endless back and forth. I'll bring up that we should finalize our move-in date, and he'll tell me to wait until we're closer. I'll suggest we start packing a few things early to avoid the mad rush at the end, and he'll say, why pack stuff we're still using? It's gotten to the point where I'm sneaking around to update my spreadsheet on my phone when he's not looking, just so I can feel like something's moving forward. It all hit a breaking point a few nights ago. We were watching a show, and I casually mentioned that I'd found a few solid movers who could work within our timeline and budget if we booked soon. Nate sighed like this was all some big burden. Do we really need to be thinking about movers already? He asked, sounding honestly exhausted. Why not give it another week or two? I tried to keep my cool, but it just all came pouring out. Because, Nate, I don't want to be scrambling at the last minute. We're not just moving cities. We're moving to New York. It's going to be stressful enough as it is, and I don't understand why you don't see the benefit in making things easier by planning ahead. He set his jaw and gave me this look I hadn't seen from him before. Because planning it down to the hour is making it more stressful. We're not going to run out of apartments or moving companies just because we didn't book them 3 weeks out. I'm just trying to keep us both sane. We sat there, staring at each other, both of us convinced we were right. Finally, he just said, look, if you really need to plan everything down to the wire, go ahead. But I don't want to spend our last month here obsessing over every little detail. That stung. I don't think he meant to make me feel like I was the only one obsessing, but that's how it landed. I told him that all my planning was about protecting us from chaos, from being in a city where everything is so competitive and fast-paced that you can't afford to be unprepared. He just shook his head, looking almost sad. Maybe it's about trust, he said quietly. Trust that we can handle whatever comes, even if we don't have it all mapped out. Since then, it's been tense. We're both trying to compromise in small ways. He's humoring me by letting me handle a few more early preparations, like making a packing schedule and looking into sublet options. but I can tell it's wearing on him. Every time I bring up something about the move, he has that same tired look, like he's counting down the days until I stop talking about it altogether. Meanwhile, I've tried to loosen up a bit, letting a few things slide off the spreadsheet and keeping my timeline a little more flexible. I'm doing my best to let go of the urge to manage every last detail. But if I'm honest, it feels like I'm walking a tightrope. I can't shake the feeling that if we don't cover our bases now, it's going to come back to bite us later. I love Nate, and I want to respect his approach, but it's so hard not to feel like I'm the only one who's seeing all the possible pitfalls. He just sees the opportunity, and I see the risks that come with it. I'm torn between trying to relax and let things happen as he suggests, and needing to make sure we're not setting ourselves up for a stressful move. So, I'm at this point where I don't know if I'm helping or hurting by pushing for more structure. Am I overthinking it? Should I just trust his approach and hope everything works? So, here's the background. My boyfriend, Chris, and I had this anniversary weekend planned at a cabin in the mountains. It was going to be just the two of us. No phones, no work emails, just peace and quiet in a beautiful setting. Or, that was the idea anyway. We agreed we'd both take care of planning half the trip. I'd cover food and activities, and he'd handle logistics like booking the cabin, the drive, and any gear we needed for hikes. I thought we were both on the same page. Simple, relaxing, and away from the noise of our regular lives. But as the weekend got closer, Chris started sending me links to things he wanted us to do. These weren't chill activities. We're talking about sunrise hikes, zip lining, and even a full-day rafting tour. Basically, the opposite of relaxing. I tried dropping hints that maybe we didn't need to pack the whole weekend, but he was so excited that I didn't want to rain on his parade. He kept saying how he wanted us to make the most of it and have a memorable time. Meanwhile, I was looking forward to cozy fires, long naps, and lazy mornings with no alarms. The night before we left, I asked him if he'd made a list of the things we'd need for the weekend. That's when I found out he hadn't done any packing. Not even the basics. He didn't even have the groceries for meals we'd planned. He'd spent all his time booking these big activities, but we didn't have the essentials. So I tried to play it cool and did a last-minute shopping run, threw everything into bags, and loaded up the car myself. By the time we actually got on the road, we were already behind schedule. I was exhausted, and he was bouncing in his seat, hyped about getting there in time for some waterfall hike he'd scheduled for 5 p.m. By the time we finally arrived, I was barely holding it together. I was ready to unpack, unwind, and maybe open a bottle of wine. But Chris was already raring to go for that hike, despite it being a 2-hour round trip with maybe 30 minutes of daylight left. "Come on, we don't want to miss it," he said, practically dragging me out of the car. I felt like I hadn't even had a chance to breathe. Halfway up the trail, I was already miserable. The hike was steep, and I could barely keep up with him as he bounded up the trail like an overexcited golden retriever. He kept telling me to enjoy the moment, but all I could think about was how much more enjoyable the moment would be if I were warm, fed, and not huffing and puffing up a mountain at dusk. When we finally reached the top, the view was okay. I mean, it was a nice view, but the sun had already set, so we were just standing there in the dark, out of breath with nothing but Chris's phone flashlight for company. I wasn't impressed, and I could tell he was disappointed that I didn't seem thrilled. We barely talked on the way back down. The next morning, I tried to slow things down by making us a big breakfast, hoping we'd ease into the day and just relax. But nope. Chris was already looking at the clock, saying we needed to finish breakfast quickly if we were going to make it to the ziplining place. I finally snapped and said, "Can we just not schedule every minute of this weekend? I wanted this to be relaxing." He looked at me, genuinely confused. "But this is relaxing. I thought you wanted to have a good time. I didn't think you'd want to just sit around and do nothing." "Well, I didn't think we'd be rushing around the whole weekend either," I shot back. "I planned this whole weekend to unwind, not to run from one adrenaline rush to the next. This was supposed to be a getaway, not a triathlon." The look on his face was pure frustration. "Look, if you'd told me you wanted to sit in the cabin all day, I wouldn't have bothered planning anything. But I thought you wanted this to be memorable." "It can still be memorable without ziplining and waterfall hikes," I said. "It would actually be nice to just be together without all this noise. It's like I have to compete with your checklist for your attention." Chris sighed and sat down on the couch, looking at his phone like it might have the answers. Well, if that's really what you want, we can just cancel everything and sit here. But it's not exactly what I had in mind. At that point, I was irritated enough to call his bluff. Fine, I said, let's cancel the activities. If this weekend was supposed to be about us, let's actually make it about us and not some action-packed schedule. So he canceled the ziplining and the rafting tour, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. For the rest of the day, there was this thick tension between us. We ended up just sitting around in silence or making small talk, which felt like the opposite of what we'd hoped for. I tried a couple of times to lighten the mood, suggesting we cook dinner together or watch a movie, but he just mumbled, "Whatever you want." Finally, that evening, he broke. "I feel like I ruined this trip," he said, looking genuinely hurt. "I just wanted it to be amazing, but I feel like you're mad at me for even trying." I tried to explain that I wasn't mad at him for wanting to make it special. I just felt like we had different definitions of what that meant. But he kept saying, "Well, you could have just told me you didn't want to do anything." Like somehow this was all my fault for not laying out my expectations from the beginning. We ended up spending the last day in this weird standoff, both of us too stubborn to fully apologize or admit that maybe we'd both been at fault. He thought he knew what I wanted, and I figured he'd understand that my idea of a getaway didn't involve extreme sports and a packed schedule. Now I'm left wondering if maybe I should have been more upfront, or if he just bulldozed over what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend because he was trying too hard to make it exciting. Either way, we both left feeling disappointed, and now I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was being unreasonable. When my mom first suggested that I move back to help out with my dad, I honestly thought it was just talk. They were getting older, sure, but they were healthy enough, still living in the same house I'd grown up in. I lived a few hours away, close enough to visit often, but far enough to feel like I had my own life. Then I got the call. Dad had had a fall. Nothing too serious, but serious enough to remind us all of his age. And in that moment, it hit me like a freight train. They weren't just getting older. They were old, and they needed me. "Please just think about it," Mom had said that night over the phone. I could hear the fatigue in her voice. Years of looking after Dad and holding everything together. He's going to need more help from now on. And honestly, I can't do it alone. She wasn't wrong. But this wasn't just some quick decision for me. Moving back would mean leaving everything I'd built over the past decade. My job, my friends, my life in the city. And if I was being honest, leaving my girlfriend, Alana. I'd always known Alana valued her independence as much as I did. We'd both fought hard to build lives on our own terms. And part of what I loved about her was that we'd done it together without sacrificing who we were as individuals. But I also knew she wasn't ready to make a move like this, especially not back to my small hometown where life moved slower and was defined by tradition and family obligations. So, that night I told her everything. She listened quietly, letting me get it all out. When I finished, she just looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that felt a lot like dread. "Wow," she finally said, exhaling. "I knew your dad's health was. I just didn't think." "I know," I said, reaching for her hand. "I didn't think I'd have to make this decision either." She pulled her hand away, resting it on her knee. "So, you're really considering it? Giving up everything here, just like that?" I felt a pang of frustration at her tone. I hadn't expected this to be easy, but I thought she'd at least understand why this felt important. "It's not just like that, Alana. It's my family. They need me. My mom's getting older, and with Dad's condition, I don't know how long she can handle this alone." She nodded slowly, biting her lip. "But what about us? You're asking me to just pick up and move to a town where I know no one, leave my job and my life here." "I'm not asking you to do anything," I interrupted, trying to stay calm. "I'd never ask you to uproot your life like that. I know it's a big ask, and if you don't want to come with me, I'll get it. I need to be there for them, Alana. I don't think I can live with myself if I don't." She looked away, her jaw tight. "So, you're really going to do this? Move back? Change everything? For what? A few more years with your parents?" The bitterness in her voice stung, and I struggled to keep my frustration in check. "Alana, they're my family. This is my dad's health. How can you act like it doesn't matter?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that it doesn't matter, but we've built something here. A life, a future. We've talked about getting married, buying a place together. How are we supposed to do that if you're off living in some town that's hours away? Maybe we put that on hold, I said quietly, hating the words as they came out. Maybe we figure things out as we go. I don't want to lose you, but I can't just ignore what's happening with my family. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. I just never pictured you being the kind of person to sacrifice everything for something like this. Something like this? I echoed, the hurt slipping into my voice. It's not just something, Alana. It's my dad, my mom. I can't let them down. She looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. I get it, okay? I get that it's hard, but I thought we were building a future together. I didn't realize your family would come before that, before us. I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. I thought you'd understand, that you'd at least try to see it from my side. I don't want to leave everything behind, but I can't ignore the fact that they need me, and I'm their only son. It's not something I can walk away from. Her face softened, but the hurt in her eyes didn't fade. So, where does that leave us? The question hung between us like a storm cloud, heavy and unanswerable. I didn't know what to say, because part of me had hoped she'd understand, maybe even come with me. But looking at her now, I realized that wasn't what she wanted. This was a crossroads, and there was no easy answer. I don't know, I said finally, the words feeling hollow. Maybe we figure it out as we go. I can visit, we can make plans for weekends. It's not forever. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough for her. She'd built a life in the city, a life she was proud of, and she'd worked just as hard as I had to get there. Asking her to uproot all that for something she didn't fully believe in would only lead to resentment. And yet, walking away from my family in their time of need felt like abandoning a part of myself. Long distance? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Is that what we've come to? I didn't have a better answer. I wished I could give her something more certain, something that would make this choice easier. But every answer felt wrong, felt like it was pulling us further apart. I know it's not what you want, I said, reaching for her hand again. But I don't know what else to do, Alana. I have to be there for them. I hoped you'd understand. She looked at me for a long time, and finally, she pulled her hand away. Maybe we're just not in the same place anymore, she said, her voice shaky but firm. I love you, Jake, but I can't put my life on hold. And I can't ask you to ignore what your family needs. Maybe this is where we both go our separate ways. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, like a piece of me was being ripped away. But I could see that in her eyes. She'd already made her decision. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything we'd built slipping away. I knew that walking away from her would mean losing one of the best things in my life, but staying would mean turning my back on my family, and on the part of me that needed to be there for them. I'll always care about you, I said, feeling the words catch in my throat. I have to do this, Alana. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. And I have to do what's right for me. We held each other for a long moment, a silent goodbye. Then, finally, I let go, each step away from her, feeling like another piece of my heart was being left behind. As I walked out of her apartment, I knew I was making the right choice for my family. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself behind with her. And now, here I am, halfway packed, wondering if I'm making a mistake I can never undo. Alright, so here's what happened with my friend Lydia last weekend. It was her graduation party, and she was finally getting her degree after going back to school for a few years. She'd worked hard for it, and I was genuinely proud of her, but apparently, now I'm in the doghouse for what I thought was just a normal conversation. The night started out pretty low-key, just a bunch of us at her parents' place, a nice backyard setup, drinks flowing, everyone congratulating her. Lydia looked really happy, and her family was practically glowing, bragging to anyone who'd listen about how she graduated with honors. Don't get me wrong, I get it, but it was a little over the top. Every few minutes, her mom would go on about how much she sacrificed and how amazing her grades were, and I couldn't help but think, all right, chill. It's not like she's curing cancer. She got her degree in communications, which is great and all, but let's just keep it in perspective. So anyway, after about the fifth Lydia's so inspiring toast, I tried to add my 2 cents. When it was my turn to speak, I said, I'm so happy for Lydia. I know firsthand how tough balancing school and work can be. I shared how I'd worked full-time while finishing my own degree a few years back, and how exhausting it was. I figured this would show her that I totally understood her struggle, that I'd been through the same late nights and stress. I even joked, "You made it look easy, LYD," but I remember almost falling asleep at my desk trying to juggle it all. She gave me a small smile, but a few of our friends gave each other this look, like I'd just broken some unspoken rule by bringing up my own experience. I didn't really get it. I mean, if we're talking about accomplishments, why couldn't I mention mine too? Later, Lydia's cousin was talking to me about how Lydia is going to use her degree to climb the corporate ladder, and how she's going to be such a force in the field. I'm happy for her, but let's be real. Communications is competitive, and not everyone who graduates just lands a dream job. So I said, "That's awesome. It's not an easy industry, but if anyone can do it, it's Lydia." I remember when I graduated, it took me a few rounds of applications and a lot of rejections to get started. But it all works out in the end if you keep at it. Lydia overheard me and shot me this kind of blank look like I'd just rained on her parade. But I was just being realistic. I mean, someone should remind her that it's not all going to be sunshine and job offers right out the gate. I wasn't trying to say she couldn't do it. I was just saying I'd been there too and knew how tough it could be. I thought she'd appreciate a bit of practical advice. After that, I was feeling a little out of place, but I figured, hey, maybe it was just nerves getting to her. So when another friend, Sarah, brought up the topic of student loans, something I know Lydia's had to deal with, I thought this was my chance to actually connect with her on something meaningful. So I said, "Lydia, you're going to do great, and honestly, paying off those loans feels amazing once you finally get to it. I had a mountain of debt when I graduated, but I tackled it in a couple of years, even while working that entry-level job. You'll be debt-free before you know it." But this time, she actually sighed and said, "Thanks, but could we maybe just celebrate without making it sound like it's going to be so hard?" I was a little taken aback, but I brushed it off with a laugh like, "I'm just trying to keep it real." I thought we were having one of those big sisterly conversations where I was just sharing wisdom from experience. I mean, she's about to face the real world, and it's a lot tougher than school. I figured a dose of reality wouldn't hurt. The rest of the night felt a bit tense after that, but I didn't think too much of it until the next day when one of our friends, Sam, texted me. She said, "Hey, I think you might have been a little too focused on your own stuff last night. It was Lydia's moment, and it seemed like you kept bringing it back to you." I was honestly baffled. All I'd done was share my experiences. It's not like I took over the party or anything. I'd made a few comments, that's all. So I told Sam, I was just trying to relate to her. I've been through all of that, so why wouldn't I share? Isn't that what friends do? Sam texted back, "Yeah, but it felt like every time someone tried to celebrate Lydia, you'd bring up how you'd done it too, or even harder. It came off like you were downplaying her success." That didn't sit well with me. I mean, I know what I said, and it wasn't like I was dismissing Lydia's success. I was just sharing my story, showing her that I understood her journey because I'd walked the same path. If anything, I thought I was being supportive by reminding her she wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being oversensitive. Like, why is it such a crime to bring up my own life just because someone else is in the spotlight? So I texted Lydia directly, just to clear the air. I told her, "Hey, sorry if anything I said last night rubbed you the wrong way. I was only trying to show you that I get what you're going through. You're going to do great, and I wanted you to know that." She replied with a short message that said, "Thanks, but sometimes it feels like you're always making it about how much harder you had it, and it kind of takes the joy out of it for me." That hit me hard. I didn't think I'd made it about how much harder my experience was, just that it was similar, so she'd know I understood. I didn't say my path was more impressive or anything, just that I've also faced challenges. If anything, I thought it would be nice for her to hear from someone who'd been in her shoes, so she wouldn't feel like she was the only one who'd gone through it. Now Lydia's been a bit distant, and Sam says I need to learn to just let other people shine. But honestly, I don't think I did anything wrong. I wasn't trying to make her moment about me. I was just joining the conversation with my own experience. Is that really so terrible? So now I'm asking myself, did I really do something wrong? Or is everyone just being sensitive?